My name is Tamara Bertrand Jones, and I am an associate professor and associate chair in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. Welcome to our second R3 of the semester. And as I mentioned before, we are so excited for you to join us today. As a department, we have recently adopted a land acknowledgement statement. And a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects the role of Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land. Through our land acknowledgement, we honor the relationship between Indigenous peoples, their traditional territories, and our current residents on the land. I want to share with you our land acknowledgement for the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. And you can find this coming soon on our website in case you'd like to use it for, or use it to modify for your own professional or personal use. We, within Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Florida State University, acknowledge that our university is located on the indigenous lands of the Appalachian Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. We highlight and pay respect to this history, understand how the state of Florida and Florida State University came to be settled on these lands. We recognize this land as enslavement, settler, colonial violence, the desolation of culture, and the forced removal of Indigenous bodies. Despite this, we respect the cultural and ceremonial practices these Indigenous nations maintain in and around Tallahassee today. As educators, we honor the knowledge of these tribes and their people and acknowledge that Indigenous students, faculty, and administrators are vital to Florida State University. We embrace the decolonization of our educational system and commit to disrupting suppressive systems through the explorations of many truths and lived experiences, and creating room for those who are often excluded by harmful colonial erasures in our practice and pedagogy. I share that with you as a start, one, because we as a department want to make sure that we are acknowledging this as a part of our history, seeing as though we have recently celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, or some folks celebrated Columbus Day on Monday. I think this conversation is actually pretty timely. And from us, what we'd like to do today is to share with you, we have several faculty colleagues from around the university that have decolonized in many ways their own learning, their own thinking, as well as influenced their curriculum as well as their own pedagogy. And so today we'll hear more about how they've been able to do this work. And hopefully this will serve as a model and as a resource for you as you are engaged in thinking about decolonizing your own practice and your own learning. So let me share a little bit about who our panelists are today. As I continue to go on today, please feel free to use the chat. We will be monitoring the chat as our panel proceeds today. So if you have questions or comments, you can feel free to use the chat. We are, we can't hear your verbal affirmations. So if you have a or amen or 2 snaps, go ahead and feel free to show up on camera and give us that and our panelists that verbal affirmation, or give us a thumbs up, perfect, or a Zoom reaction. We love those as a way of maintaining our engagement here. So our first panelist is Dr. Antonio Cuyler. Dr. Cuyler is Associate Professor of Arts Administration and MA Program Director in the Art Education Department. He is internationally recognized for his expertise and scholarship on internships in arts management, as well as his work on access, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the cultural sector. In his research, he explores the ways that the cultural sector can ensure and protect the creative justice of all people. His work has appeared in prestigious domestic and international journals. Dr. Marcia Porter is professor of voice in the College of Education. An award-winning soprano, Dr. Porter made her New York solo recital debut in Wheel Recital Hall at Carnegie Hall in 2005. An active recitalist, Fulbright Scholar, and Rotary International Cultural Ambassadorial, there we go, Ambassadorial Scholar, has performed in numerous venues throughout the United States, Italy, Brazil, and the Czech Republic. Dr. Porter has sung at prestigious international and local festivals. She's also a much sought after clinician and has presented master classes throughout the Midwestern and Southeastern United States. Dr. Delia Poey is professor of Spanish in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. Dr. Poey is a specialist in U.S. Latino literatures and cultures. She's published numerous anthologies of Latino literatures and Latin American women's fiction, as well as 2 scholarly books, Cuban Women and Salsa to the Beat of Their Own Drum, and Latino American Literature in the Classroom. Dr. Jessica Wendorf Muhamad is an assistant professor of communication and associate director of the Center for Hispanic Communication in the School of Communication here at FSU. Dr. Wendorf Muhamad is also the director of PEAKS Laboratory. PEAKS stands for Participatory Experientially Based Applied Knowledge for Social Change, which is focused on developing through action research evidence-based interventions for complex social issues. She is an accomplished and well-published scholar. Dr. Wendorf Muhammad's research focuses on understanding how and why enacted entertainment, educational experiences, game-based interventions influence individuals. And last but not least, we have Dr. Leslie Richardson. Dr. Richardson is the director of the Center for the Advancement of Teaching at FSU. And prior to her current role, Dr. Richardson taught for 8 years in the English department at Xavier University. She also served as the university's faculty and residence at Xavier's Teaching Center. And we are excited about the leadership that Leslie brings to the center, and particularly her support of faculty in this work. Thank you all so much for being here with us and being willing to share your expertise in this area. Yes, we have quite in the sense of their professional areas as well as their research areas and personal background. So I'm excited about that. Okay, we're gonna jump right in. What has decolonizing learning meant to you? Why don't we start? Leslie, you're the closest to me in my Zoom view, so would you like to start us off?
Sure. I'll try not to talk too long because I think my colleagues have a lot more nuanced insights than I do. But for me, it means a couple of different things. I think on the one hand, of course, it means helping our students and ourselves to historicize our fields and our disciplines and how knowledge has been produced historically, and to sort of critique our epistemology. So of course we need to think about like who has had the opportunity to gain or determine what counts as expertise, who has decided what sorts of questions we ask, what counts as evidence, you know, what's valid, what are our methodologies. All of those need to be historicized so that we can see how power has acted in them and how they're not sort of handed down as like, this is right and it has just been uncovered, but instead people have made it, and they have made it in motivated ways, right? So I think it's really important for us to study that ourselves, but also to make sure that we give our students access to that when, you know, when we're providing learning experiences for them. But for me, it's at least as important to think about the kinds of classroom experiences I'm offering my students and to think about how power is happening in our own classrooms. And so I wanted to sort of start out by asking a silly question. how many of you had to take that little test in the 4th grade that was really about following directions? And so you were told to write your, oh, I see some hands up, right? You were told to put your name at the top and then put your pencil down. And then you were given minutes to look at the questions and know that you could answer them, but you weren't supposed to write. And then your paper was taken away, right? So you passed the test if you didn't write on it, right? So it was just it was a quiz on following directions. And when I was an undergraduate, I thought that I had figured out school. And I used to tell my friends who were struggling, like, every class at college is really a class about following directions, right? And when I think about that advice now, I'm appalled, right? But at the time, I never questioned the right of faculty to just set hoops for us to jump through, right? I just thought that that was how the power structure worked. And I was pleased with myself for my ability to follow directions. And I'm mortified to think about it now. But unfortunately, that perspective shaped my early teaching. But I have fortunately come to realize that I really would aspire to do something more as Bell Hooks would advise us to do, and create a more emancipatory learning experience, right? An empowering learning experience that lets our students do the thinking. And so I think a lot about power in my classroom and how to democratize my classroom, how to ensure that instead of knowledge being something that I have gained and I will, parsimoniously piece out to my students like crumb by crumb, instead it's something that we're building together, right? And that they have perspectives and experiences and insights that I benefit from, but we all need to do our thinking together, right? So it has become really, really important to me to resist the urge to do all the thinking for my students, but instead to step back and let them do the thinking for themselves, and to trust their powers, and to enable them to sort of stretch themselves and come into their powers. And I think that is an important part of what this means to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Delia, you're right next to Leslie in my Zoom view. So what does decolonizing your learning mean to you?
Well, for me, decolonizing as a learner started in my own process. As in my education, I did not see myself in the curriculum. So those questions started very, very early on and clearly influenced my my current field, which is Latinx studies. But in terms of decolonizing my own learning and translating that into pedagogical practice, that is a much more arduous task because, as Leslie has said, it really starts with decolonizing the space of the classroom. And that means not reproducing. The easiest thing that we can do is sort of reproduce what we are familiar with, right? The way we are taught is then the way we teach. But to really think through what it means to decolonize that space really does mean relinquishing hierarchy. And clearly as instructors, then we are implicated in that. So yes, of course, we guide the learning, right? We're responsible for the syllabus, but we also have to relinquish that a bit and stand on that unshaky, sort of not unshaky, the shaky ground. The other thing that I think is so important in terms of decolonizing is that it's a process. We are never done. And if we just view it as that we are constantly in that process, the same process that our students are in, the process of unlearning and opening up and learning in different ways, not just different material. If we see it as that process, I think it really guides what we do and what we don't do, what we refrain from doing.
Hold that thought, because we're going to talk about some of those don't do's and how you may have stopped doing some of them. Antonio, what has decolonizing your learning meant to you?
So, yeah, I want to start with this quote that I read by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. He said, "Philosophers have long conceded, however, that every man has two educators, that which is given to him and the other that which he gives himself. Of the two kinds, the latter is by far the more desirable. And I quote Dr. Woodson because I read The Miseducation of the Negro the summer before I started my first faculty position at Savannah College of Art and Design. And I'm glad that I read the book before I started teaching, because what it helped me to realize is that what it means for me to decolonize learning is to see education as a liberatory process. And to not, again, as I've heard my colleagues say earlier, to not commit epistemic violence by perpetuating some of the systems and the ways of thinking about learning and education that were passed down to me. And so then, how I've tried to do that is by encouraging my students to apply this kind of thinking and interrogating and questioning of everything, not just to the course content, but even outside of class and other ways and other aspects of their lives, so that they are participating in beginning their own process of liberation.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, okay, liberation, man. Marcia, Dr. Porter, what does decolonizing your learning mean to you?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to make one correction first. I'm actually from the College of Music. Yes. I think you said College of Education. I know quite a few people over there, but anyway, so for me, I don't really, it wasn't until you asked me about being on the panel that I even thought about decolonization of my education or my learning, because in a sense I've been doing it all along. And the all along by offering my students the opportunity to make space for themselves in my classes, the opportunity to bring their own heritage to the class, yes, and as Dr. Cuyler said, question everything, yes, and not just the course content, but everything about things outside of a class, and how do those things influence us, because being in the arts, everything external influences what we do. So in my classes, I'm always thinking in terms of making space for everyone, representing various voices, because as a singer, as a musician, we have to do that. Otherwise, we ourselves don't have a place to grow and any space to create our own music. And if we are always only looking towards European models, yes, to make the music, we eventually run out of options, right? And you eventually come across music that just doesn't speak to your soul, right? And then you can't express your innermost thoughts and feelings because you haven't found that music that touches you in that way. So for me, it's always been a process. And for me, it really means including and representing everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Jessica, Dr. Wendorf, Muhamad, what is decolonizing your learning? What has that meant to you?
So I would like to say I agree with everything that's been said thus far, right? And I think that if I were to add anything, it's that for me, given my heritage, I am Colombian, it's meant a process of understanding that learning to be a certain way happens outside of traditional spaces, and it is embedded in the way that I was socialized. A country that was the hub of the transatlantic slave trade, right? That is where I am from, and there was this mixtures of cultures, but one was perceived to be better than others. There was, if you were associated or had an affinity toward the Spaniard, that was better than the slave that came on the ship or the indigenous person that existed. And as a white passing Hispanic, it's been very challenging to see how subtle that has been in my life. At times I'm able to recognize it very overtly, and recognize my privilege, and recognize how I was socialized within that system. But at other times, it's not that obvious to me. And so it's really been an unpacking of everything, actively resisting and unlearning everything that I held to be true. right? Understanding that although I worked hard to get a PhD, the fact that I am white passing within the system that I was raised allowed me to get a PhD, right? And not diminishing my efforts, but understanding the privilege that I carried, and understanding the violence that there was in some of those actions, right? I think that I would also add that it is a traumatic experience to understand. For me, I'll speak about myself. For me, it's been a traumatic experience of understanding that things that I believed to be true were untrue, right? Because it's meant that I've had to dig deep into my identity and then say, am I complicit in these behaviors, right? The oppressed becomes the oppressor. And how does that look? And how can I challenge that? And how can I turn that on its head? In the classroom, which I know we're going to get to later, I think that my biggest process or the most significant process of unlearning that I tried to do is to reorganize, as we've talked about, the power in the classroom, and understanding that, yes, I am charged with facilitating a space, right? That is my charge. That is my role and responsibility as an employee of a higher ed institution, but I am not banking or depositing knowledge into people. I am facilitating a space. The syllabus is my attempt at curating the space, but it is open for negotiation and it's flexible. So some tangible activities that I do is that before I hand it out on first day, because I think that's just overwhelming, I have students say, what do you expect you would find in a syllabus? What are your most salient and pressing questions? And they write those down. Then I hand my syllabus and I said, if I've done my job correctly, then you should find the answer. And if you're not, it's on me to reorganize this, right? And so beyond just including voices that have been underrepresented, it's, I think, redistributing the power so that individuals in that space all know you can come as you are, because not this is a welcoming space, but because we're going to bring less violence to the space, right? At times the focus of inclusion has been applauded because if we include people, then we're doing better. But that is so closely parallel to tokenism, right? And so how do we create agency and autonomy, and how do we truly invite people to show up if the space and the system wasn't designed by them or for them? And so that small exercise, and I'm not saying it's the best, but of redistributing power through the syllabus is a way of saying, design your space, not just exist in the space that I think you need to exist in. So.
Thank you. There's so much to unpack there, and I'll try to, I think part of what I'm hearing, and if I even reflect on my own personal experience, a lot of this starts with unpacking our own learning or our own miseducation, to start with where Antonio started. What were some of the things that you did on your own to help unpack or decolonize your own mind in order to be able to create the space, to curate the space, to use Jessica's language, where learning was liberatory or is a liberatory practice in your classrooms? Antonio, would you like to start us off?
Sure. The first thing I did was I gave myself permission to question. No one else gave me permission to question. And, you know, similar to Dr. Porter, I started my higher education experience studying voice. I was headed down the operatic performance track and then got to my senior year and was like, I don't know, right? And so by giving myself permission to question, to interrogate, I actually realized that I was dissatisfied wholly with the education that I had received. Because, as some of my colleagues pointed out, I did not see myself entirely, you know. In undergraduate school, we used to have a Black composers concert, of course, during Black History Month. That was one of the only times that we got to sing music by Black composers. And even, for example, when we would sing Negro spirituals in the choir, because of course, we always have to close with a Negro spiritual, right? Like that just is so exciting. Not one time did the choral conductor, who was white, talk about the historical context from which Negro spirituals emerged.
Mm-hmm.
Never, not once did he invite the Black students who were performance majors or education majors singing in the choir to share their lived experiences that might have taken the performance even to another level for the students who did not identify as Black, singing among their peers about those experiences. And so I think the most important thing that I did was to give myself permission to ask questions, to ask why. You know, for another example, and I'll stop, is that I remember when I first started studying voice, I started studying with a Black voice teacher in 4th grade. And she was very excited to get me on this path towards moving towards singing opera and singing classically. But when I got to performing arts high school, I went to, because I started, you know, in high school studying voice, and this path towards opera, I started studying with white voice teachers. And all of the white voice teachers said, Antonio, if you expect to be a serious opera singer, you have to stop singing gospel. Now think about the existential crisis that placed me in, because gospel was the way that I actually discovered that I actually could sing, right? So, so I wasn't willing, and you know, that was one of the kinds of questions I had to ask myself: is this true? Like, now, my choir directors at church never once said, Antonio, if you expect to be a serious gospel singer, you can't be singing no opera, right? Like, so it didn't work the same way. I think that in gospel, there was this kind of assumption that, oh, if you're getting education on how to sing properly, that's going to make your gospel singing even better. And so I saw the process as assimilation and culturation and socialization, and I resisted. And it took me a while to give myself permission to resist, because I was like, wait, I want to do this and I'm serious about it, but do I really have to let go this part of myself and my identity?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can
Marcia?
oh gosh, I have to piggyback on that, because I sat smiling because there's so much to say about your experience, right? And I teach applied voice in the College of Music. I also teach a graduate vocal literature class every other year, and the topic changes. So this year I'm teaching about British vocal literature, okay? And 2 years ago I taught a class, again, a graduate literature class on American women composers since 1950. So, you know, you're thinking, oh, she's teaching a class on British vocal literature. Okay. Well, how do we involve any Afrocentrism in that topic, right? Well, we started the class talking about a British composer who actually was influenced by American Negro spirituals. He came to live in the U.S., actually lived in Florida for a little bit, and was taught some spirituals by H.T. Burley. Harry T. Burley was African-American composer and singer who helped Antonin Dvorak learn about the American Negro spiritual, and Dvorak incorporated some of those spirituals into his own music. And so then we went on to talk about Samuel Coleridge Taylor. And my students were like, oh, okay, so who is this? Well, let me tell you. Samuel Coleridge Taylor was an Afro-British composer who actually traveled to the U.S. Quite a few times during the turn of the 20th century, and made friends with the likes of Marcus Garvey, Paul Laurence Dunbar, who's a poet, and the people who were beginning of the Pan-Africanism, which has now morphed into something else. So we talked about him. We got a chance to talk about the Fisk Jubilee Singers. We got a chance to talk about, this is in my British literature class, okay? British literature class. So we talked about a whole bunch of stuff. And today I got a chance to include a discussion about stride piano and jazz in my British literature class. On Tuesday, I'm going to bring in Bessie Smith. and the blues and the Harlem Renaissance and spirituals, again, in my British vocal literature class, a class that is usually centered around, white British composers, and hardly ever do the students get a chance to talk about American styles that impacted British music, yes? Hardly ever do they get an opportunity to discuss the fact that there were Afro-Brit composers who were writing at that time, that there were singers of that time who were not European, right? In the summers, I get a chance to teach through the IP programs in London and in Spain. Every opportunity I get, I am teaching my students about everything. Yes, any and everything. We talk about Brazilian music, we talk about Caribbean music, we talk about the Africanisms that are present in all of those musics. And I think, to go back to what Dr. Cuyler was saying, my education wasn't like that. My music education didn't talk about any of these composers, didn't talk the black composers, didn't talk about Langston Hughes, the poet, didn't talk about how his poetry impacted many, many composers, didn't talk about Paul Laurence Dunbar, the poet, and didn't talk about composers who didn't arrange spirituals. Yes, and that's the other issue. When we talk about Black classical music and vocal music, the first thing we think about, and sometimes for some people the only thing we think, are spirituals, right? But that isn't the case. There are beautiful art songs and symphonies and operas, all kinds of things written by, Black composers. And I have to speak from that realm because that's my heritage, right? And I'm learning more about that, and I'm teaching people about that because sometimes you don't get that information. And I'll say one other thing. So I'm also smiling because this would be the third year. So 2 years ago, I did the first that I know of ever concert on campus of art songs, which are totally different from spirituals. If you want a discussion about it, we can talk about it later. But anyway, art songs of music by Black composers. And I thought, okay, first of all, how many people am I going to have in the audience? I wasn't singing. It was students from one of my classes, okay? So just to help you understand the demographic of my classes, this year I actually have 2 Black students and an Asian student. 2 years ago, I didn't have a single Black student in my class, okay? But the entire class sang art songs and spirituals of Black composers. And that's so important because as musicians, we sometimes forget that people want permission. They want to understand first how they're going to sing this music that doesn't represent them. And one of my colleagues always says, well, hey, look, I'm not German, and I sing Mozart and Strauss and Wagner, and I sing all of these other European composers, so why wouldn't you sing a spiritual? If you do the research on it and you understand the history of the music, why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you sing an art song by a Black composer? You do the research on the composer and the poet, why wouldn't you sing it? So for me, it's not the idea of tokenism or anything like that. It's when you include people, you are educating them on otherness. Yeah, and otherness is even a kind of a derogatory way to think about just, thinking beyond yourself, basically. Thinking beyond yourself and trying to get other people to understand what it is that you do, trying to offer them opportunities and options to do something different. Because as Dr. Cuyler said, we teach as we were taught, right? And at a certain moment, you have to veer on the side and say, well, hey, wait a minute. Let me back up and question that. Why was I taught that? Why didn't you ever tell me these things? And I'm a singer, I can talk forever. So if you have questions, please just send me an email, and we can do a Zoom to chat about it. But it's really important to include people. And I think also giving permission is a part of, I guess, getting rid of the power struggles that come into place in a classroom, using a syllabus, things like that. So, yes.
So you and Antonio both talk about the sort of giving permission. So just to be clear, we give everybody permission here. If you needed somebody to tell you that it was okay for you to question, it was okay for you to dig deeper, I, Tamara Bertrand Jones here, giving you permission. But part of what I know, even outside of this permission, is that we may be giving permission, but this is not what our students encounter on a daily basis. There's a reason why we've had to decolonize our learning, because learning has been colonized, and that is what has been normal to our students. Delia, can you talk to me a little bit about how you maybe give me an example of a time you encountered some resistance from students who weren't really open to this learning and inclusion, and hearing about something different, and what you may have done or didn't do to talk about or to address that resistance?
Sure. So I've been at FSU for forever and a day. I think it's 18 years or something like that. And I have to say that I'm very hopeful, because students have changed very much from 18 years ago to now. 18 years ago, when I would present material, I don't know, Gloria Anzaldúa, Borderlands, it's a difficult text. It's a text that deals with violence and colonial violence and gender and sexuality. And I had a lot of resistance from students at that time. I had to just sort of take it apart. I think anybody who's been in a classroom knows that, we don't react to students in an emotional way, that's just never productive. We have to just be very deadpan about it. But I would have to just really, really work with students on that level. And that has eased up. I don't know if I've gotten better at it, or if students actually have been changing. When they come to us with their experience, they're already in a different place than they were 18 years ago. But I do want to say, in terms of the syllabus, I want to just circle back to the mention of how you decolonize the syllabus even. And I think that that's what we're all talking about. The one thing that I've really learned to make my job easier, and also to make the course just more fruitful, is to move away from those models of inclusion that really do border on tokenism. The models of inclusion were, oh, now we have to include these texts. Okay, I'll throw them at the end of the course, right? What I've learned is that restructuring my syllabus so that I take the most marginalized voice, right? At the historic moment, we're talking a lot about amplification. This is just a really simple way to do it. I take the most marginalized voice on my syllabus that I'm going to include in my syllabus. And I include several, but I take the most marginalized and I put that text first. And just by putting that text first on the syllabus, because, as Leslie mentioned, students are trained to follow directions, I use that bad learning. Students have been taught that the first text in the course is the foundation, which is a very colonial way of thinking. So I just flip it and I put the most marginalized voice first, and I tap into their own sort of already ability to see that then as the important text that will guide the rest of the course. And if you do that, it's really interesting, because students then very organically circle back to that text, right? So if I take the most, I'm teaching a Latin American literature course, for example, I'm going to start with an indigenous activist text at the start. And then when we go back and look at the colonial period, moving on up to independence movements or whatever, they just circle back. So that isn't where we end, that is where we start. And I think that remapping has worked for me as a learner, but I think it's a simple way to start the remapping for students in a way that they're not resisting at all, because they're just in their brain, then it just works. It's like, oh, this is what's important. Now I have to read everything in relationship to this.
Thank you for sharing that. Jessica, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, so I would add that it is phenomenal, the power of like confirmation bias, right? What you believe to be important, and then you get more evidence. And so if we situate these readings and this inclusion as the start of the conversation that is our semester together, right? Learning is a extended conversation. Then it frames the way that students are thinking. And I would say that beyond that, right? And to avoid this issue of tokenism, it's not the removal of knowledge that has existed because they happen to be white, but the inclusion, the purposeful and intentional inclusion, and the shift in learning outcomes in metrics and rubrics for grading in the entire thing, right? Because I can't say, well, I'm going to decolonize by introducing these readings of diverse voices, but I'm going to grade you on a merit-based system that privileges the white dominant group, you know? And so it's in our grading, it's in our measurable outcomes as such, right? So do we get growth oriented? You know, so it's all of the material associated with that space. And I think that what has been really helpful to me is readings from like Eve Tuck or Sarah Ahmed that talk about this issue of small steps, that small steps sometimes give innocence to the guilty. I think it's settlers moving into innocence is the way that they term it. And although we want to take steps in a direction, right? Small steps sometimes are problematic because they give the illusion of having done enough, right? And so I actively challenge myself when I am engaging in decolonizing work, and I can't always do it, and I don't always do it well. Is this just a small step, or is this a small step with action and commitment? Is this you know, like, what is this? How is this embodied, right? And how is this packaged? And that helps me in not just doing things to feel good or for show or to feel that I'm engaging in part of something. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but I'm just at a point right now where I want to go beyond. I want to move into purposeful action that reduces harm and trauma. And so I want to be very careful. So when I'm including a reading, and this could be potentially just my knowledge of health, right? And health communication particularly, it's okay. Messages can have reactance, psychological resistance, right? Is this a message, right, that could have resistance or reactance? And am I putting the scholar, the author, in danger by presenting this work in such a way? And so working to mitigate that psychological reactance or resistance to material that could be challenging that happens to be authored by excluded voices has been another really helpful thing for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hearing you all talk about this, it reminds me, one, you make it sound very exciting and a little easy to do. But I think that there's a lot of work that is involved in one, shifting your curriculum, especially if it's something that you have inherited. If it's something that you were able to build yourself, it's much easier to start from this place. But for classes that we may have inherited, for learning spaces that are not ours, that we are now find ourselves responsible for, can you tell me something that you may have done practically? Because we have lots of folks here on our call are either going to be responsible for learning spaces or are responsible for learning spaces, and this may be a new thing for them. What is something tangible that or a piece of advice that you have learned along the way that you think would be helpful for veteran faculty, veteran teachers, or even the novice teachers who want to decolonize their syllabus or decolonize their classrooms? That's cool. Marcia, yep.
So, I actually wanted to go back a little bit only to come forward. Yes, I really like the idea of starting in a particular space, so or with an idea, concept of, and not just starting from that place, but including other examples of that throughout. So going back to what I think Delia said, starting with a particular topic that makes the students always have to regroup and return to that location. I think for me, what I have learned to do, because I inherited the classes that I'm teaching, it was partially, starting from a place within, making sure to always infuse more, and allow the students to ask the questions. And, daily I end up reshaping my syllabus. This is the topic outline. We may do this, we may not. And right now I'm slightly behind because the students had questions about things that they didn't understand. So I paused and said, okay, I will make another discussion and we'll talk about this. So allowing yourself, one, to start in a place and then continue to infuse that information through various routes. Yes. And then also not to take it personally if they don't like what you're doing. And sometimes you don't find that out until that thing called, student review.
Evaluations.
Yeah, that. Sometimes you don't find out until then. Well, unfortunately, it's too late for you to do anything for that cohort of students. But realizing that even if they, it's just raving reviews, it's so wonderful. There's always something that we can learn from that. I usually throw those to the side and say, okay, I can't really get much. I want to know what the person who really hated this class, why did you hate the class? What can I do to make the class better? And always remembering that it isn't about me. It's what information did I forget to give you that maybe for some reason or other you didn't think to ask. And whenever a student stays behind to ask a question, I always say, okay, do you mind if I share this question with the class? Because if you asked me, someone else wants to know, and that means I need to do something different to make sure that you all understand where we're coming from or where I'm coming from. So I don't want us to get confused by thinking that, inclusion is bordering on tokenism, is bordering on this. It's really a broader concept, I think, and it is such a delicate one, and it's almost like walking a very thin line, trying to figure out how far can I go this way before I lose my class, and how far can I go this way before I offend people in the class, so it's really trying to listen to your students, ask questions, of them, of yourself, of your colleagues. What do you think about this? What should I do instead of this? Or have you thought about this? Or why are we still doing it this way? So I think this, it's a timely discussion. It's a difficult discussion to have. And just trying to figure out the best practice for pursuing all of those goals.
Leslie, you serve in a very important role at the university. And so the sort of helping to our faculty, our teachers become even better teachers. And so how do you deal with this in your work? How do you help faculty to think about this? What are some advice that you share with them?
Oh, what a great question. I was thinking right now a little bit more about students, but a lot of times we are asking students who might be resistant to think about things that challenge them. And I was thinking that one of the most important things we can do if we're wanting to change our classrooms, but also if we want to offer emancipatory or challenging kinds of educational experiences, is learn as much about the students as we can. Right, and always remember that although we're changing our curricula, It's people that we're teaching and not issues, right? And so we need to find out what do they know and believe and cherish when they come to our classes, so we can help them see how they might need to grow, or so that we can see what they need. And that starts from the beginning of the class, or maybe before the semester even starts. We can be surveying them and asking for reflections, but also all along, right? So one of the sort of strategies of being what we might call a critically reflective teacher is to almost weekly be asking students how they're feeling about the learning, right? Where do they feel like they really are growing? Where are they feeling challenged? Where are they skeptical? So that that way also we aren't as startled sometimes by the evaluations later on, but they really need to be part of it, right? So all too often in all of their years of schooling before they get to us, education has been something that has been done unto them, right? Like they've been supposed to like hold something in their declarative memories, purge it, and then move on, right? But if we want to offer them learning experiences that are the sort that they really need, we have to be really attentive to those sort of social and emotional aspects of the learning, and think about creating community. And I think that's been on my mind a lot in the past few years is teaching really conservative, really resistant students and figuring out how to reel them in, right? And a lot of times they approach the sorts of courses that I teach already hostile, right? And thinking that they're going to be alienated, and then because of that, not able to learn, right? And so I have to figure out like how to help these students feel part of a community too, right? Even though if I think about them as voters, I think that we should just dispense with them and not waste any of our energy on them, right? But when they're my students, it's my job to figure out like how to help them change. And that is, for me, sometimes some of the biggest challenge is to figure out how to lower their defenses and bring them into the community and help them to change their values, right? Help them to have a value for hearing from others, or seeing a version of history that might challenge their centrality, right? That might challenge them in all sorts of ways. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but like, anyway, I think that trying to build community and figure out how students can have bonds amongst themselves is also really, really important. And so just tending to those interpersonal parts of the learning environment, I think is one of the first and most important goals.
Thank you so much. Antonio, what advice or steps would you have for people wanting to do this work?
Okay, I saw Jessica's hand, and if
I'm sorry, I missed it. Yes.
Thank you, but you can go ahead. I can say it later.
Okay, I'll try to be really quick.
We'll get you next.
So I think there are three things that come to mind for me. Number one, democratizing access to success in my classes is really important, and trying to create multiple entry points for different kinds of people who will come to the class. And, you know, I do this exercise when I sit back and I try to envision, okay, who's coming into the cohort this time, right? And, you know, also not necessarily relaxing my standards and what I expect of my students, because what I expect of the students is to learn, right? But how they demonstrate that they're learning, I'm more flexible around that. And so like right now I am on sabbatical and teaching at the University of Michigan, where I'm having a lot of fun. And so I'm teaching this performing arts management class, which I inherited, but I decided to do something different. And so another thing is giving myself permission to do something different, right? Even though it might be perceived as controversial. And so what I decided to do was to use textbooks written by female identified authors first, right? So, you know, because what I told my students is that, you know, women or female identified scholars in our field have critical epistemologies that are different than their male colleagues. And so if I want to center their voices around performing arts management, because we don't often do that, we're doing this intentionally, and I'm giving you content to debate about in class through the discussion board because we're remote. But also to add another element to that, we are engaging with guest speakers who all identify as Black.
Mm-hmm.
So I just made the decision. I gave myself permission, and it's working out really well so far. And the way that I, advise the students to think about it, I said, imagine that these individuals invited you to lunch and they're having a conversation that you're getting to listen to. And your contribution to the conversation is what you will document through the discussion board. And so the conversation will continue because you'll be having that conversation with your classmates as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing I wanted to say, I've been really fortunate in terms of like a method that I built into checking and evaluating if the class is doing what it's supposed to do. One particular class that I teach at FSU, Arts and Community Engagement, explicitly uses arts and culture to engage with social issues. And so I had a practice of showing the movie Fruitvale Station in class. And every time I showed this movie in class, there would always be a white male student who resisted, right? And he just, couldn't understand, well, if the Black guy had done X, Y, Z, he wouldn't have got shot by the police and da-da-da-da-da, right? So what's been fascinating is that I sit back and observe, actually, to see which of the students in class are going to help their classmate to understand the fallacy in their thinking. And inevitably, every single time, I've been really fortunate. So I'm anticipating the time when I have to step in and say to the student, well, you're kind of blaming the victim maybe, right? Or ask the question, how might you be blaming the victim, right? And the students kind of bring that student to a conclusion that, oh, I need to rethink what I've been thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts them on the process of kind of critically reflecting about everything. And I think that's what my goal is.
Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. And it doesn't come from you. It's coming from the environment that has been created, the individuals involved in that environment. Jessica, you had some things I'm sure you want to add.
Some things, and I have more things. So congratulations on your sabbatical. Technically, I was supposed to be in Colombia on Fulbright. So I just pretend that this is the Caribbean. And I'm just, I'm just a block away from campus now. So congratulations. No, I wanted to first acknowledge what Dr. Porter said, right? That the fear of falling into the behavior of tokenism. So inclusion should not be governed by a fear of it becoming tokenism. They are so distinct. They are. And I'm so grateful that she's said that a few times today, because they are. And the fear to make mistakes should not stop us from trying. And we shouldn't not include because I'm like, we're tokenizing. I think it's that critical awareness of, okay, am I a white passing or a white instructor in a completely white class that has had no feedback on my syllabus, right? So it's critical reflection and internal reflection. What I was going to say about like a tangible exercise that I have begun implementing is to really check myself when I'm falling into universalisms. I was sold that as a child, that there was a path to growth, right? And symphonies were better than autochthonous music. We have the cumbia and other autochthonous music, since we're all talking about music, and that wasn't good. That's pentatonic scale 5. You need to have like classical and wind instruments. And I don't know, sold the idea that our languages, our indigenous languages weren't good enough. And so very much a development paradigm, right? Where there is a universal truth and we all aspire to get there. And it comes up all the time for me. So before getting on the Zoom call, I was trying to, in my mind, say, okay, what am I going to say? Am I going to say the right thing? There it is again, right? That socialization, that there is a big T capital truth and that I am deficient if I don't achieve it, right? And so I really practiced within myself taking inventory of that. And so for the classroom, tangible exercise, I try to out myself. I try to say there's no big T capital truth. There's no universalism. If and that way the students can call me on it if I begin to engage in that behavior. If I begin to say, well, the foundational text here is, call me out, right? And so putting myself out there. And then the other practice that I've begun to do, following this idea of like multiplexity, right? That and reciprocity, that people will engage with me more if they know who I am and if they trust me. If there is a relationship, is that at the beginning of my class, again, before the syllabus, before anything, I sit in a chair, and I have sometimes intercultural comm is a large lecture, 120 when we were in person. Sometimes it's a small seminar, and I say for the next 15 minutes, you can ask me anything, as long as, you know, caveat by answering, I don't get fired. I like my job. First one to go into higher ed, right? First advanced degree in my family. I need to keep my job. But you can ask me anything. And if you don't want to ask, you don't have to ask, and we'll use this time to settle into our learning space together. And nothing's off limits, because if they know who I am, my fundamental belief is that they will understand that the work that I put into the class is coming from a place of best intentions for them, or from my knowledge, my expertise, my lack of knowledge in some areas, my individual characteristics, such as being a mom or being Hispanic, right? That informs and frames my worldview, my standpoint. And so if they know that about me, then perhaps they'll trust me more. And I think that trust is fundamental to learning, because I didn't learn often because I didn't trust the people and what they were telling me, and in good reason, because they were lying to me. Columbus Day, you know, I started doing research into human trafficking and sexual exploitation, and that's the day Columbus Day ended for me. I was like, wait a minute, 1940 nothing, you know? So trust, I think. And so I'm not suggesting anyone here or anywhere, has to sit in front of the classroom for 15 minutes, but how can you think about bridging trust and reciprocity, and how that enables us to complete our function in the classroom, which is to teach?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Delia, how has this, what advice would you give, or comments on what has already been said?
Yeah, well, I think that what everybody said is really sort of the basis of everything, right? We have to listen to our students, really listen, including, or maybe most particularly, the most resistant students. Really listen. And if we're going to make our classrooms a decolonizing space, we have to relinquish power. And to do that, we have to trust our students. I agree with what Antonio said, that when I do have a student who's just basically coming from a very conservative, not a lot of opportunities to gain broader views. I mean, these are very young people that we serve, not exclusively, but a lot of them are. It is usually, not usually, I would say it's always first other students who jump in. And then it becomes peer-to-peer. And that is the most effective way, to where my only stepping in is to sort of summarize and say, well, here we are, you know, that's it. So yes, relinquishing that power is also, we have to think about it, is also empowering students to question, and empowering students to really engage with one another as learners, in bringing all that they are to the classroom. And the last thing I want to say is that I want to just go back to what Jessica said about evaluation. Just today, I was thinking, I've never believed in grades as an educator. I just don't. And every year that I stay in this profession, I double down on my conviction that this just isn't the way to do this. But we are in a system that is demanding that this is the way to do this. So we have to just look at how we work within this system that we're a part of. How are we reproducing it? But how are we sort of carving out spaces where we can do things differently? So evaluation is something that I have been thinking about much more intentionally in the last few years. And yes, being flexible about how we evaluate. Standards and evaluation are, you know, they're related, but the way that we do it, it's not about standards, right? It's about fulfilling these requirements. So that's something that I am continuously working on. And I think that anybody who's going to get into a classroom shouldn't just take it as a given, should always be questioning the process of what we do.
You are not the first, most recently that has mentioned this, the ideas of grades. And so Leslie, maybe this is a topic that we need to explore as faculty, and maybe Kat can help us with that. But I definitely think that this is something that will continue to come up, especially as we try to all continue to question, interrogate what we're doing, and make sure that students are at the center of this learning. So how can we broaden the evidence of their learning?
We could certainly make most of our courses better aligned and let students have some say in what the goals are. And really, grades, if there are anything, should be feedback to students about how they're making progress towards the goals, right? So because we have more experience in a field, we design the learning experience for them, but they are the ones who are doing the work, right? Doing the learning, and we're just giving them feedback, right? To help them make as much progress as possible. I would love to talk about grading and specifications grading and all sorts of things with people who want to adjust how you've set up your courses. It's one of my favorite things. Also, I know that we're out of time, but you pointed out that this is hard work, right? And sometimes small steps aren't enough, but they seem like the only thing we know how to do. It's a hard work, but it's also work that's best done in community. And so, especially within, just peer groups, but also within departments and programs, it's really valuable to get together and be able to challenge and push each other. If anybody's interested, Kat can also help to structure that, right? To facilitate it or make this space, help you devise your goals and the sorts of things that you might want to do together to sort of push yourselves along in decolonizing both your classroom spaces and your curricula. So it's such important work. It's some of the most important work that universities can be doing now. I just want to support you in any way that we could, if there's interest, right? So just know that we're here.
Thank you so much.
It's incredible work that you do.
We appreciate that offer, and we'll likely take you up on that. Antonio, you unmuted. You want to say some closing remarks before we end today?
Well, I was thinking, grading, until we can have AI do the grading for us, I think it will always be the bane of educators' existence. But thank you for the opportunity. It was wonderful to participate in this discussion. And I did think of one last thing. Decolonizing your syllabi, your curricula, is one means to doing this work that I think is in alignment with, parallel to access, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I encourage everyone listening today, particularly if you are an educator, to explore anti-racism as a theoretical framework for your curricula, or culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally responsive. Explore all four of them and find the one that resonates the most with you, and use that as your path. Decolonizing is the path that some of us took, and I want you to know there are other options out there that might get you to similar outcomes, and so explore.
Thank you for giving us permission to explore and to question. Y'all, I know we are definitely over time, but I think we could continue to talk and ask more questions of our panelists, but I want to thank you all for being here. We appreciate you, and we also appreciate all of you out there who took the time to be with us today. This will be recorded, so I'll make sure to share this recording with our panelists, and so if you'd like to forward that or share that with others that weren't able to make it, you can do so. Our next R3 is scheduled for October the 28th, and that will be on feedback. So we talked a little bit about grading and feedback and this approach to learning. And so we'll be talking about doctoral feedback and how to receive as well as give good feedback that can be used for growth and development. So thank you all again for being here, and we look forward to our next time together. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.